They had just fired the second charge when the freight wagon broke loose, and I did not think about the odds before I ran toward it. I only knew that Sarah Pruitt's boy was standing in the wagon's path with his eyes fixed on the smoke overhead instead of the ground in front of him. The brass mortar Josie Rourke had wheeled into the middle of Cottonwood Flats as one dirt street let out its second concussion, a hard, flat crack that rolled off the false front buildings like a fist against a drum, and the freight team hitched outside the mercantile reared hard enough to snap their brake and bolt straight down the crowded street with nobody in the driver's seat to stop them. I was 40 feet off, leaning against the livery rail with my arms crossed and my opinion of the whole business already settled, and then I wasn't leaning against anything at all. I do not remember deciding to move. I remember the boy's yellow shirt, and the horse's eyes rolled white, and the specific, useless thought that I had sworn off running toward other people's disasters 2 towns back. I got the boy by the collar and threw us both clear of the wheels with maybe half a second to spare, and I felt the wind of the wagons passing hot against my back before it swerved wide around Pruitt's mercantile and finally hung up on the horse trough outside the bank, splintering 2 boards and dumping 100 pounds of dry goods into the street. The crowd that had gathered to watch a woman try to shoot rain out of a Kansas sky went from silent wonder to shouting panic in the space of that one concussion, and by the time the dust settled, half of Cottonwood Flats was looking at Josie Rourke like she had nearly gotten a child killed, and the other half was looking at me like I'd done something remarkable, when the truth was I had only done the one thing I still knew how to do without thinking twice about it. My name is Caleb Marsh, and I did not come to Kansas to save anybody. I came because a horse ranch 4 counties over had failed under me the way everything in a drought fails eventually, slow and then all at once, and because the particular kind of failure I carry does not improve with a change of scenery. Only a change of scenery makes it easier to pretend otherwise for a while. I had watched my own father lose 80 acres in Nebraska to a banknote he did not understand the terms of until the terms had already closed around him. Signed in a good year on the promise of rain that had simply stopped coming 3 seasons running. The same story playing out now in Kansas dirt, as though the whole country had learned nothing from the last man it ruined this way. I had promised myself young that I would never again stand by while paperwork did to somebody what a gun could not do faster. That promise had not held up well against 3 years of drought and a stranger's rain cannon going off in the middle of Main Street. But there it was anyway, still buried somewhere in me, waiting on a boy in a yellow shirt to prove it hadn't died with my father's land. Josie Rourke had come through Cottonwood Flats 2 weeks earlier with a wagon painted over in fading gold lettering, RURK Pluviculture, Scientific Rainmaking, Guaranteed Results, and a brass mortar cannon her father had built to fire concussion charges 1,000 feet into a dry sky, on the theory, not entirely her own invention, that a hard enough shock to the air would collapse whatever moisture was hiding up there into rain. It was a theory the United States government itself had spent money testing down in Texas a few years back, with results depending entirely on who you asked and how badly they needed to believe it had worked. Wheat in Cottonwood Flats was fetching 60 cents a bushel that year if it grew at all, down from nearly $1 before the drought began, which for most of the county's homesteads was not enough to cover a Kansas mortgage taken out 3 years earlier against the promise of an ordinary rainfall that had simply stopped coming. Those mortgages had come cheap and easy in the good years, Eastern trust companies falling over themselves to lend against Kansas land at rates that looked reasonable on paper and turned punishing the first season a farmer missed a payment. And half the county understood by now that the men who'd written those notes had never much cared whether the wheat came in, so long as the land did, one way or another. Josie's demonstration had been paid for, publicly, by a subscription passed around the churches and the Grange Hall, $400 raised in coins and IOUs from people who did not have $400 to spare on anything, let alone a woman with a cannon and her dead father's theory. I did not believe in it. I want to say that plainly, because everything that came after started with me standing at that livery rail with my arms crossed, certain I was watching a con artist work a desperate town, and I was wrong about exactly enough of that to matter. She came to find me that evening at the boarding house, not to thank me, though she did that too in a clipped, unpracticed way like gratitude was a language she hadn't used much lately, but because she'd heard I'd once studied law back east before whatever had brought me west, and she needed someone in this town who could read a contract without a stake in lying to her about what it said. She had a paper in her satchel from Cyrus Dalton, the town's banker, a clean-shaven man in a grey tailored suit and silver spectacles who kept a gold watch chain polished bright against the general dust of the county. A man I had shaken hands with exactly once and trusted exactly as far as that handshake. A financing agreement she'd signed in Abilene 3 weeks before arriving, one she'd been too grateful for the travelling money to read closely. I sat with her at the boarding house's kitchen table under a smoking lamp and read it twice. And the second time through I found the clause that would have told a lawyer everything and told an honest rainmaker's daughter nothing at all. If the demonstration failed to produce measurable rainfall within the contracted window, Dalton's financing company held the right to collect not from her, but from the subscription committee itself, meaning the same $400 in grocery money and grange dues that had paid for her wagon's passage into town. She did not look like a woman running a con when she read that clause back to herself. She looked like a woman finding out, for the second time in her life, that her father's work had been used by somebody smarter than either of them ever to be anything but a weapon. Her father, Ephraim Rourke, had been a real scientist once, or near enough, a meteorologist with a government commission and 3 published papers before a demonstration in Ohio went wrong in front of the wrong newspaperman, and he'd spent the last 6 years of his life touring county fairs with a cannon and a theory nobody respectable would fund anymore, dying in a rented room in Dodge City, owing more than the wagon was worth. Josie had buried him with his silver pocket barometer still in his coat pocket because she couldn't bring herself to take it out, and then she'd gone back for it 2 days later because leaving it in the ground felt like agreeing with everyone who'd called him a fraud. She carried it now on a chain at her belt, checked it a dozen times a day out of habit more than need, tapped the glass the way her father always had before he'd say a number out loud like it settled an argument. I told her the clause could very likely be broken, a financing agreement that shifted default liability onto a third party who'd never signed it wouldn't survive 5 minutes in front of an honest judge, but that breaking it would take proof Dalton had drafted it that way on purpose, and proof takes time neither of us had before the contracted demonstration window closed in 9 days. If you're still with me on this one, I'd be glad to have you along through the rest of it. It costs nothing to subscribe, and I'll have another story like this one waiting for you next week. We spent those 9 days the way people spend time when they've decided to trust each other faster than either one is entirely comfortable admitting. I rode with her out to the county recorder's office to pull whatever paper existed on Dalton's financing company, a Topeka outfit with an address that turned out to be a rented desk in somebody else's law office, the kind of arrangement that told you plenty about a company's intentions without a single fact needing to be proven yet. We ate supper most evenings at the boarding house with Osgood's ledgers spread between the plates, and twice we rode out past the county line to ask questions of 2 other rainmakers' tours that had come through Kansas the same season Josie's had, both of them financed, it turned out, by the same Topeka address under 2 different names. She showed me her father's old field notebooks, cramped columns of barometric readings and humidity counts going back 15 years, and somewhere in the 3rd night of reading them by lamplight I stopped seeing a con artist's inheritance and started seeing a genuinely careful man's life's work, wrong about plenty but honest about all of it. There was an afternoon we spent checking her mortar's fuse mechanism against the specifications in her father's own hand, sitting close enough on the wagon's tailgate that our shoulders kept touching, and she asked me, without any let-up at all, whether I'd ever gone back to Nebraska to see what became of my father's land. I told her I hadn't, because I already knew, and I opened my mouth to tell her the rest of it, the part I hadn't said out loud to anyone in 4 years, and a rifle shot cracked somewhere out past the north pasture, close enough that both our heads turned hard toward the sound before either of us could finish anything. It was only a rancher shooting a coyote off his stock, we found out the next morning. But I never did finish that sentence, and there were 4 days left on Dalton's window, and neither of us brought the coyote up again, though I have wondered since whether we were both a little relieved not to have to find out what came next so soon. The dark stretch came 2 days before the demonstration, when the recorder's office turned up nothing on Dalton beyond the rented Topeka address. The 2 other rainmakers' tours had both left Kansas owing nobody an explanation, and Josie's own mortar failed a test firing in front of half the Grange committee. The charge went off, but the fuse burned wrong too fast, hissing down to nothing before the concussion could build any real force, the kind of flaw that could mean bad manufacture from a cheap Abilene supplier, or could mean somebody had gotten to it before it ever reached her wagon. She sat on the wagon steps afterward with her father's barometer in her fist, and told me she was starting to believe the town was right to have doubted her from the start, that maybe she really was just her father's daughter in the worst sense, chasing a dead man's theory into other people's ruin. I did not have a clever answer for that. I told her I'd spent 3 years believing the same thing about myself, and it hadn't once made me right, only tired, and she looked at me a long moment like that was either the least useful thing anyone had ever said to her or exactly the thing she'd needed to hear. It was Josie who found it, not me, going back through her father's notebook a 4th time at 2 in the morning, holding it up to the lamp at an angle that caught what daylight reading never had. A second set of numbers penciled faintly into the margin of the fuse specifications in a hand that was not her father's. Someone had annotated the notebook after Josie Rourke died, adjusting the burn rate calculation by a fraction that would look like an honest miscalculation to anyone who didn't know his work by heart, and would guarantee the charge burned wrong on demonstration day. The notebook had been in a trunk shipped ahead to Cottonwood Flats by the same freight company Dalton's bank used to move its own paper. It was not proof of Dalton's hand directly, but it was proof somebody had sabotaged the mortar before it ever left Abilene, and it turned the whole failing demonstration from bad luck into a plan. We rode into town before sunrise with the notebook and the tampered fuse mechanism both, and found the recorder, a plain, tired man named Osgood who'd filed enough Kansas mortgages in 3 years to have his own private opinion of how many of them were meant to fail. Willing to summon the subscription committee and Dalton both before the demonstration's contracted hour instead of after it. I will not pretend the meeting in the Grange Hall was any kind of triumph of drama. It was 2 hours of careful, ordinary argument, Dalton's own hired attorney calling the tampered notebook circumstantial, until Osgood produced the freight company's own manifest showing the trunk had passed through a Topeka warehouse Dalton's financing company leased under a different name. The subscription committee did not need much more than that. Neither, in the end, did the rest of Cottonwood Flats. Dalton left town within the week, his tailored grey suit and gold watch chain gone from the bank counter by Thursday morning, ahead of a county attorney's letter I understand eventually caught up with him somewhere near Wichita. Josie fired the mortar again 3 days later, publicly, on a fixed fuse and her father's honest calculations, and I will tell you plainly that it did not rain that day, or the next, because her father's theory was wrong about at least that much, the way most theories chasing something as old and stubborn as weather turn out to be wrong about at least something. But the subscription committee tore up the financing agreement regardless, on the strength of what the notebook and the manifest had shown about the man who'd drawn it, and 3 weeks later, with no cannon fired at all, an ordinary front came down out of Nebraska, and it rained on Cottonwood Flats for 2 straight days, the kind of rain nobody could take credit for, and everybody was grateful for anyway. I did finish that sentence eventually, the one the rifle shot had interrupted, sitting with Josie on the wagon's tailgate the evening after the real rain finally came, both of us still smelling of wet dust in a way neither of us had smelled anything in 3 years. I told her I'd gone back to Nebraska once, in my head, every single day since I left it, and that watching her fight for her father's careful, imperfect, honestly wrong work had done something I hadn't expected, which was make me stop being ashamed of everything I'd once believed too. She didn't answer that with words. She took her father's silver barometer off its chain, turned it over once in her hand the way he used to before he'd speak a number out loud, and pressed it into my palm instead, and told me a man ought to carry something that measured the weather honestly, even when the weather refused to cooperate. I still carry it. I could not tell you most days whether it reads any truer than any other barometer ever built, but it has never once told me a lie. That's the truth of it as I lived it and no more. If it rode with you a while, stay close. I've got another for you next week.